Welcome to another episode of SPX Podcast, the Global Chessboard. Today, we dive into one of the most complex and globally discussed conflicts of our time, the war in Ukraine. This isn't just a modern political struggle. Its roots trace back decades, deeply tied to history, geopolitics, and the rise and fall of superpowers. A historical perspective: in 1922, Ukraine and Russia stood side by side as founding members of the Soviet Union, sharing an intertwined history of cooperation and mutual dependence. Ukraine was not just a partner but a core asset for the USSR, hosting key industries like shipbuilding, steel production, and even nuclear development. However, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 left Ukraine as an independent state, while Russia inherited the USSR's international role and responsibilities. Post-Soviet shifts: following the Soviet collapse, Eastern European nations began aligning with NATO, seeking security assurances against a weakened but ambitious Russia. NATO's Article 5, emphasizing collective defense, made membership a sought-after shield against potential aggression. Yet, for Russia, this expansion felt like encirclement, fueling resentment and a drive to reassert its influence. Russia's resurgence. By the early 21st century, Russia, under Vladimir Putin's leadership, began leveraging its vast natural resources, particularly oil and gas, to rebuild its economy and military strength. Dreams of restoring a Russian empire began to take shape. But as Russia rose, Ukraine struggled. A combination of political corruption and economic stagnation left the nation vulnerable. The turning point: 2014. Ukraine's crisis boiled over in 2014. Civil unrest led to the ousting of pro-Russian leaders and the annexation of Crimea by Russia. The conflict deepened as the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk saw uprisings backed by Russian forces, plunging Ukraine into a protracted and painful war. Zelensky's gamble. In 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky, a charismatic former comedian turned president, brought a pro-Western agenda to Ukraine. His goal was clear: align with NATO and the EU to secure Ukraine's sovereignty. However, this move was seen as a direct challenge to Russia, which considered Ukraine a geopolitical buffer and, symbolically, a former partner seeking divorce to join an adversarial alliance. Caught between giants, Ukraine's strategic position has become its curse. While NATO and the US offered vocal support, tangible military assistance was limited. Russia, on the other hand, saw Ukraine's western pivot as a threat, escalating tensions into a full-scale invasion in 2022. Lessons for smaller nations: choosing alliances wisely. A tale of contrasts: Ukraine versus Vietnam. Many draw parallels between Ukraine-Russia and Vietnam-China dynamics. However, Vietnam's foreign policy offers a stark contrast. Unlike Ukraine, Vietnam avoids aligning too closely with any superpower. By maintaining a neutral stance, Vietnam has avoided becoming a proxy in great power rivalries, focusing instead on self-reliance and strategic balance. No military alliances. Vietnam refrains from joining military blocs that target specific nations. Its strategy emphasizes peaceful coexistence with its northern neighbor, China, despite historical tensions and disputes. Defensive strengthening. Through consistent investment in military modernization and infrastructure, Vietnam has quietly fortified its defenses, ensuring its ability to respond to threats without relying on external powers. Diplomatic leverage. Vietnam leveraged diplomacy to balance relationships with major powers, fostering partnerships without becoming overly dependent on any single ally. Ukraine's missteps. Ukraine's full pivot to the West alienated its powerful neighbor, leading to economic sanctions, territorial losses, and prolonged conflict. By betting on distant allies while antagonizing a nearby giant, Ukraine underestimated the geopolitical realities of its position. The overthrow of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych on February 22 to 23, 2014. Triggered an immediate response from Vladimir Putin. He convened an overnight meeting with Russia's security leaders to discuss the implications of Yanukovych's removal. By the end of the meeting, Putin declared, "We must act to reclaim Crimea for Russia." The operation to annex Crimea was carried out with utmost secrecy. Communication was conducted using encrypted messages, catching the West off guard. The United Nations General Assembly later held a vote that rejected the annexation of Crimea into Russia. Of the member nations, 100 voted against, while 11, including Belarus, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, and Syria, voted in favor. Another 58 nations, including China, Cambodia, and Vietnam, abstained from voting. The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, became a strategic point for Russia. Syria, home to Russia's only military base in the Mediterranean, represented Russia's last foothold in the region. Putin used the conflict as an opportunity to modernize Russia's military forces. In September 2015, he ordered airstrikes targeting terrorist groups in Syria. The Arab Spring protests, starting in 2011, were backed by the US, UK, France, Germany, Turkey, Israel, and Arab states, with additional support from Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. This coalition contributed to turning Syria into a war-torn wasteland. The Syrian people were left in despair. Yet, the Russian-Syrian alliance managed to suppress US-backed rebel groups, symbolizing Russia's re-emergence as a global power and asserting its refusal to let the West dictate the sovereignty of nations. Russia's decisive actions, reminiscent of its approach to Crimea, showcased Putin's strategic precision. The readiness of the Russian military was also evident in January 2022, when it swiftly intervened in Kazakhstan to quell uprisings that Russia claimed were similar in nature to Ukraine's 2014 unrest. While Putin's policies are often criticized as aggressive, his actions are rooted in a pragmatic approach to Russia's national interests. The West leveraged its nuclear arsenal to dismantle the Soviet bloc, and Putin has sought to ensure Russia reaps returns on its Soviet-era investments in nuclear weapons. Critics may condemn Putin, but from a nationalistic perspective, his efforts to restore Russia's past glory appear calculated. Modern Russia operates under a parliamentary democracy, and Putin's extended leadership reflects his alignment with the Russian people's vision. Under his governance, Russia experienced economic growth, a revival of its declining birth rate, and a restoration of national pride. Despite economic sanctions from the West, Russia increased its gold reserves fourfold between 2014 and 2020, boosting its foreign reserves to $630 billion without accruing foreign debt. Technological advancements under Putin also focused on cost-effective solutions, countering the West's extravagant military spending. The West's sanctions inadvertently benefited Russia. By 2020, the country emerged as one of the top 5 food exporters globally, achieved self-sufficiency in key industries, and began exporting modern military and automotive technology. Is Russia invading Ukraine? By conventional definitions, an invasion involves a military campaign to seize or control another nation's territory. If we apply this definition, then Russia's actions qualify as an invasion. However, the real question lies in whether one condemns or supports these actions, decisions often driven by political interests rather than moral considerations. Putin has framed Russia's special military operation as a mission to protect Russian-speaking populations in Ukraine, combat alleged genocide, and demilitarize and denazify the region. He claims that once these objectives are met, Russian forces will withdraw, leaving the people to establish independent governments. Comparisons can be drawn between Russia's actions in Ukraine and the US-led invasions of Iraq and Libya. While both involved military intervention, the US pursued its objectives far from its borders. whereas Russia cites immediate security threats as its justification. As a neutral observer, particularly as a Vietnamese citizen, it's essential to prioritize national interests. The key takeaway for smaller nations is to avoid provoking powerful neighbors, while maintaining sufficient strength to command their respect when necessary.